Hey guys, welcome back to another video. In this video we're going to be going over our basic adjustment tab on the right side here, and we're just going to be going through these features here, what they do, how you can manipulate them, and a few interesting tricks and tips that you can apply when manipulating these values that can gear towards specific styles. For example, the vintage soft very sort of style that you see people using is actually achieved through these parameters here, and we're going to be covering stuff like that. So to get started here, we have our photo, and at the top we've got our treatment. Now we're just going to be leaving this on default color, but if for whatever reason you are going with black and white, you can just click black and white and that will do exactly that to your photo. Or you can rip out the saturation here to get a similar look and feel. This here actually changes the codecs itself, so you can go in and further adjust these settings and not have to work with this at -100. So we'll just double click to reset our values. So first here we have our profile. Now again, we're going to be leaving it on Adobe Color for the most part. But you do have different examples here, and you can kind of see as you click through them, they sort of read the color of the image a little bit different. Personally, I keep it on color, a little bit saturated, but I know people that use standard as well. You will also find that sometimes it will say missing profile if you're shooting with something like a drone. I personally have the Mavic 2, and every time I import those DNG files, it says missing color, so I have to manually click here and go to Adobe Color to select a profile. So underneath here we've got our temperature, so essentially to the right we have cold, and to the left we have hot. So this can be adjusted manually inside your camera, but we're going to be adjusting it here because I keep my camera on auto white balance and it tends to do a pretty good job at getting that correct. But if you would, for whatever reason, you apply, say, a preset that tends to move it into more of a cold space, you can correct that by moving it to the right. Now, you can also let Lightroom automatically do it by hitting this eyedropper here. And you can select a white in your scene, and Lightroom will do its best to make this neutral white and adjust the colors around it to fit that profile. But for now, we're just going to leave it on the default. So again, Control Z to go back. Now underneath our temperature, we have our tint. So this is great because I've noticed some sunset photos tend to have a lot of purples in them. And you can kind of offset that by dragging it to the left to bring the tint more towards the green. And vice versa, if you have a photo with a lot of green in the image, you might have to bring it towards the purples just to get rid of the greens in the shadows. So next we have our basic parameters, so our exposure, contrast, and whatnot. So we're just going to go over these here. Our exposure, pretty self-explanatory. If you bring that to the right, it's going to increase or brighten your image, and if you bring it to the left, it's going to decrease or darken your image. Now a little trick inside Lightroom, if you actually hold Alt and click on the sliders, you'll notice that your screen goes black until you start dragging it to the right, and Lightroom will show you the areas that are being blown out white. So we can just show you here, it's saying they are completely blown out white there, which means that this area here is completely losing its detail. Now I would recommend just using that for fine-tuning, but again, as you can see, if you use that at the start, you'll just kind of blow out your whole image. Maybe about, for something like this, I'd probably go with about there. Yeah, and I wouldn't worry too much about the small piece that's blown out at the top right here. It's not really too big of a deal, it's just a little reflection on the side. Now next we have our contrast, so if you move that to the right, it's going to increase or darken your image and give it that crisp, bold feel, and if you move it to the left, it's going to decrease and give it that softer feel. So for something like this, I'd probably move it towards the right because I personally like the contrast in the shadows as well as the nice highlighted spots on her face from the sun. Now next we have our highlights. So With the highlights and shadows, you can do a couple things. So you can do a split, which is essentially flattening your image. So if you move the highlights to the left, it's going to take the highlights out of your photo, and if you move them to the right, it's going to increase them. So if we move the highlights to the left and we move our shadows to the right, so we're going to remove our shadows, you'll notice that the image will look rather flat, but you'll see the most detail in the shadows as well as the detail brought back from the highlights. For most of my images, personally, I like to do this sort of split, but if you want something a little more contrasty or bright, you can bring back some of the highlights. It really depends on which area you're trying to save. Of course, for a photo like this, you wouldn't want your highlights completely to the right, as you're going to lose a lot of detail in her face. So you'll want it to be somewhere around there where you can tell that the sun is still hitting her face, but it's not completely blowing out the details in her skin. As for the shadows, this really depends on how much detail you want in your shadows. For an image like this, I'd probably keep it around here. I wouldn't want too much detail like this green here showing. It's a little bit distracting in my opinion. But at the same time, I do want to bring back some of the details and the folds in her suit that she's wearing. So we'll leave that about here. Now the whites and blacks, those are kind of similar to the highlights and the shadows, but they work a little bit differently. So if you pull the whites to the left, you'll notice that it's going to do a similar effect to the highlights, but it's more or less just changing the brightness of the whites. So we're lowering the brightness of the whites and we're increasing the brightness of the whites. It's not actually removing the highlights, as you can see here with our highlights. So we'll just keep that back about there. And for the whites, we can maybe increase them just a little bit. So as you increase the whites, you'll notice that the overall sort of tones don't necessarily change. They just kind of brighten a little bit. And with our blacks, we'll just kind of crush those just a little bit and bring them back. You can of course rip the blacks out and get a little sort of a similar effect to the shadows, but I would try to think of them as two separate entities, as they can create different effects depending on your image. For something like this, I mentioned I like the contrast, so we're just going to move it a little bit to the left. And already this is looking pretty good. If you actually hit Y on your keyboard, you'll get the before and after, so before and after. You can also hit the backslash on your keyboard and just toggle before and after. Sorry, backslash the slash on your keyboard, right above the enter key. And you can toggle back and forth. So we'll just leave it like that. And finally, we have our presence sliders just down here. So our texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. So these are very interesting. If you ever see those, the soft sort of look that you get with those Polaroid photos, or that people do that kind of vintage film look, that is essentially done by reducing the texture. So you can see as we reduce the texture, we're going to lose a lot of the sharpening detail in her hair. And if we increase it, it's going to be kind of like we're sharpening the entire image. So normally I keep this at 0. I don't mess with the texture too much, but there are some cases where I'll find that the soft kind of bloomy look looks really dreamy. Then I'll kind of reduce the texture just a little bit. Same with the clarity. The clarity too will flatten your image, as opposed to if you sharpen it like this. It kind of works like the structure filter on Instagram, if you've ever used that one, essentially adding structure and removing structure. The clarity is a slider that you really want to use rather sparingly. It's a very subtle effect, so I would only reduce it ever so slightly or increase it ever so slightly depending on your photo. For photos of people and portraits, I tend to like reduce it a little bit because it kind of cleans the skin naturally, as opposed to going in and using the brush tool to remove any blemishes. The clarity can actually fix that just a little bit. But I would never just rip it out because it gives you this kind of weird looking flat effect and it just doesn't look natural at all. But if you want, you can also stack these two effects. I do this little stack sometimes, and it kind of just gives it that soft appearance. So for something like this, where it kind of looks a little whimsical with the lighting, then you would do this softer sort of effect to just get that texture kind of in our image. Now the final slider we got here is dehaze final slider, third to final slider, dehaze. This is a great one for landscape photos. For example, if we use it on something like this, we'll just increase our exposure here so you can see. You'll notice if we increase the dehaze, we'll get a lot more detail back in the clouds. And if we reduce it, it kind of makes it look a little bit hazy. So you can use this one strategically if you've got a landscape image. I wouldn't normally recommend using the dehaze on portrait photos as it can accentuate like skin pores and stuff and make them look a little bit too powerful on the skin, and it just doesn't look natural. But this one's actually a little out of focus here. But you can use the dehaze in corporation with these filters, which we'll go over in a later lesson, to essentially mask out just areas of the sky and apply the dehaze to those specific areas so you can bring back details like these clouds. Another example, if we just do this here, same with the dehaze, we kind of bring back some colors, some contrast, and detail in the clouds, but it makes her look a little bit saturated in the process. So again, great for landscape photos. A lot of people use this for landscape photography, but not the best for portraits. So next we have our vibrance and our saturation. So the last two sliders. Now these are pretty interesting how they work in conjunction with one another, but you would want to think of it as the saturation as an overall coverage of saturation, and it's just kind of adding a saturation filter to the entire image as a whole, as opposed to the vibrance, which kind of strengthens each color individually. So they work a little bit different from each other. Personally, I like to mess with the vibrance over the saturation. And I have like a kind of a small rule that I like to follow, where if I say I increase the vibrance by like 20 here, I'll decrease the saturation by a little bit as well to kind of offset it and get that more flattened look in the colors, as opposed to just pumping the saturation in. One thing that I notice a lot of beginner artists do is they have a very big habit of just pumping these sliders up and getting this really saturated look in their images, and very big telltale for an amateur photographer. You can kind of see her skin just looks unnatural when it's like this. So I would recommend that you keep these relatively zeroed out and add them later if you need, once you go over the HSL sliders, which we will cover in another video. Because here you can kind of fine tune each color with your saturation, and then if you still find it's a little bit too saturated overall at the end of that process, then I would come back and adjust these sliders. So even though you adjust these sliders first when you're editing your photos, you can always come back to them and fine tune them later on to better get the desired look and effect that you're looking for. So that is essentially it, guys. 13 minutes is pretty good for just explaining this small area here. We went into some pretty heavy detail on each individual thing, but now you should have a better understanding of how these sliders affect your image. But that is all for this video. In the next one, we're going to be covering the tone curve, so our next adjustment, a very powerful and confusing tool, but we're going to try and simplify it so you guys can better understand it. And that is all for this one, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.